beloved icon of the wrestling world, the man millions believed was larger than life, the warrior who once seemed indestructible. For decades, his voice echoed through arenas and televisions, promising strength, loyalty, and victory. But late one quiet night, when the cameras were long gone and the cheering crowds had faded into memory, a locked door inside his private home forced investigators to confront a possibility no fan ever wanted to imagine. For most of the world, Hulk Hogan was not just a wrestler. He was a symbol, a living legend, whose red and yellow colors once felt as permanent as the American flag. Children grew up shouting his name. Fathers lifted their sons onto their shoulders, while arenas roared with thunder. And for years, that energy followed him everywhere. But behind the fame, behind the muscles, the smiles, and the bright lights, there were whispers. The house itself stood quietly behind tall palms and long driveways, hidden from the curious eyes of fans and reporters. It had always been described as a place where the superstar could finally breathe, away from cameras, away from the endless expectations of the world. Friends who visited often described the property as peaceful, even spiritual. Hogan himself sometimes said the house was where he went to think about his life, his mistakes, and the weight of the years that had slowly caught up with him. But there was one room few people ever saw. Staff members later admitted they knew about the door, a heavy door, reinforced and sealed more carefully than the others in the house. It sat quietly down a narrow hallway that rarely appeared in photographs or interviews. When visitors passed by, Hogan would casually steer conversations elsewhere. Sometimes he would laugh it off and say the room was just storage. Other times, he would grow strangely quiet. Over the years, the mystery became part of quiet conversations among those who worked there. One housekeeper later described how the hallway always felt different, colder somehow, as if the air itself carried memories that nobody wanted to disturb. But nobody asked questions. Because when someone becomes a legend, people learn not to look too closely at the shadows. As the decades passed, Hogan's life slowly changed. The powerful body that once lifted giants began to break down. Surgeries came one after another. Friends whispered about the pain he lived with daily. Nights grew longer. The roar of the crowd faded into something more distant. Some of those closest to him noticed something else, too. Regret. It wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it appeared during long conversations after midnight. Sometimes it showed in his eyes when old footage played on television. The same man who once tore his shirt apart before millions of screaming fans would sometimes sit silently, staring at the screen as if he were watching someone else's life. One former colleague from the wrestling world remembered visiting him during those years. He said Hogan talked about things he had never spoken about publicly. Not the victories, not the championships, but the moments that followed the cameras turning off. The arguments, the betrayals, the personal battles that never appeared in the ring. Names came up during those conversations, famous names. There were stories about late nights with other wrestling legends, complicated friendships with figures like Ric Flair, emotional memories involving Andre the Giant that still haunted him long after the Giant was gone. Sometimes Hogan would pause mid-sentence, as if remembering something he wished he could erase. And always, eventually, the conversation would drift toward the same quiet subject: the past. But no one ever connected those moments to the locked room. Not yet, not yet. Years later, when investigators finally stepped into the house under circumstances that remain partially sealed in records, the property looked almost untouched. Photographs still hung on the walls showing Hogan standing triumphantly beside other giants of entertainment. Smiling moments with celebrities. Old championship belts displayed proudly in glass cases. Yet something about the atmosphere felt heavy. One officer later described it as walking through a museum dedicated to a man who had lived several different lives. And at the end of that hallway, the door waited. The same door staff members had walked past for years. At first, it looked ordinary, just another wooden barrier separating one room from the rest of the house. But closer inspection revealed details that made the investigators pause. Multiple locks, reinforced hinges, and marks along the frame that suggested the door had been opened and closed countless times with careful precision. Inside the house, the silence felt overwhelming. Outside, the world still believed it understood Hulk Hogan, the champion, the entertainer, the larger-than-life personality who told generations to say their prayers and eat their vitamins. But standing in that hallway, one officer reportedly whispered something that would later echo through quiet conversations among those present. "Whatever's in there," he said softly, "it mattered enough for him to hide it from everyone." No cheering crowds, no flashing lights, just a closed door and decades of unanswered questions. For a moment, nobody moved. Because sometimes the most frightening thing is not what you see. It's what someone tried so hard to keep hidden. And when the first lock finally turned, the truth waiting on the other side would leave even hardened investigators standing in stunned silence. Type, continue, and I will write the next part. Continue, legendary figures, as often spend their lives building an image so powerful that the world begins to believe the image is the entire truth. For decades, that image surrounded Hulk Hogan like an unbreakable shield. The bandana, the booming voice, the promise that the hero would always stand tall in the end. But the moment that final lock clicked open, the illusion that had protected him for so long began to quietly crumble. The investigators pushed the door slowly, almost cautiously, as if they expected the room itself to resist them. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Just darkness beyond the doorway and the faint smell of dust mixed with something older, something that had not been disturbed in years. When the light finally reached inside, the first thing they noticed was how carefully everything had been arranged. It was not chaos, not a messy storage room like Hogan had once joked about. It was organized, methodical. The room looked almost like a private archive, shelves stretched across the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with boxes that had been labeled in Hogan's own handwriting. Thick notebooks sat stacked beside faded photographs. Old recording equipment rested on a wooden table that looked decades old. But what truly stopped everyone in the doorway was the wall directly opposite them. It was covered with pictures, hundreds of them. Some were familiar images taken from wrestling history, moments the world had already seen, victory poses under bright arena lights, fans reaching out from crowds that stretched into darkness. But mixed among those famous images were photographs nobody had ever seen before, private moments, backstage arguments, late-night meetings, night meetings, and faces of people who had long disappeared from public conversation. One photo in particular caught an investigator's attention. It showed Hogan sitting beside the towering figure of Andre the Giant. The two men looked exhausted, sitting in what appeared to be a quiet hotel hallway sometime in the 1980s. There were no cameras, no cheering crowds, just two legends staring silently toward the floor. Someone had written a small note beneath the picture. Things were already falling apart. Another photograph showed Hogan standing with Ric Flair, both of them younger, laughing with drinks in their hands. But again, beneath the image was another short line written in faded ink. We promised never to talk about that night. The deeper the investigators stepped into the room, the stranger the atmosphere became. Because this wasn't just memorabilia. It was a timeline. A private history of moments Hogan had apparently chosen to remember, and possibly regret. Boxes contained letters from friends who had passed away. Some were emotional messages about loyalty, betrayal, and forgiveness. Others were barely readable, stained with age and time. One officer carefully opened a small wooden case and found several old cassette tapes. Each tape had a date written on it. The earliest one appeared to be from the mid-1980s, during the height of Hogan's fame. The most recent recording was far more unsettling. It was labeled only a few months before his final public appearances began to slow down. The realization slowly spread through the room. These were recordings, personal recordings. Confessions, perhaps. The kind of messages someone leaves behind when they believe the world has misunderstood them for far too long. Nearby, a thick journal lay open on a desk. The pages were filled with long, handwritten entries. Some lines were written clearly, while others looked rushed, as if Hogan had been struggling to keep up with thoughts that refused to slow down. One passage near the center of the book made the investigator reading it pause. It spoke about the cost of becoming a symbol. Hogan described the moment he realized the fans no longer saw a man. They saw a character, a myth that had to remain strong no matter what was happening inside his real life. He wrote about the pressure, the injuries, the loneliness that came after the arenas emptied. And then the writing suddenly changed. The tone became darker. There were references to arguments that had nearly destroyed lifelong friendships. Mentions of deals that were made behind closed doors during the explosive rise of professional wrestling in the 1980s and 1990s. Names appeared again and again, people who had shaped the industry alongside him. Some of those names belonged to powerful figures connected to world wrestling entertainment during its most explosive years of growth. But one particular sentence stood out more than the rest. It was underlined several times. I tried to tell the truth once, but nobody wanted to hear it. The investigators exchanged quiet glances. This room wasn't just a collection of memories. It was something far more personal. Almost like a man preparing his final testimony. Then one of the agents noticed something hidden beneath the desk. A smaller locked drawer. Unlike the door outside, this lock looked newer, recently maintained. Inside the drawer, they found something none of them expected. A single sealed envelope. Across the front, written slowly in thick black ink, were 5 simple words. If something happens to me,